We had a corner shop and my mum used to spend most of the day at the till whilst my dad was doing shift work. And originally, obviously, my mum, the only clothes that she had were her salwar kameez, and that's what she'd wear every day. She could hear people coming into the shop saying certain words like racial slurs. She'd hear them say "paki" under their breath, laugh at her. And like day by day, she kept hearing all those things and seeing people's reaction when they walk into the shop and see her as she was. And it's quite sad when I think about it now, because then my mum, she tried to save up as much change as she could. And she went to Marks and Spencer's and bought a pair of jeans that were on sale. And she wore one of my dad's naf jackets. I don't know, anyone from the 80s and 90s would remember naf jackets. Those these big bomber jackets that are now seen as really vintage and cool. She would wear that jacket and a pair of jeans, just so people would stop really ridiculing her for wearing traditional Punjabi clothing. We see this music video on a TV screen of a white woman wearing those exact clothes and those exact things that she could not even wear when she was that age or when she was first here. And it was kind of that painful realization that what was ours and wasn't allowed to be ours is now seen as fashionable and is now seen as cool. If you're wearing bindis to Coachella because it looks cool, without any understanding of what it is or where it comes from, that's what's problematic, and that's what we need to start changing. And that's not only the South Asian culture, we've seen it happen to black culture, perhaps more so, and it's been happening for longer for them. In America, obviously, Native Americans, it's been happening for their culture and their context as well. And it's painful when you see these things as costumes or you see these things being worn on like Halloween. Like, that is painful for these people that for years and years and years and decades it's been seen as something they needed to hide because they felt they needed to assimilate into society because they were going to be ridiculed for it. And now it's been taken away from them, and now it's being kind of, it's now a commodity, people making money out of it. When I was growing up as a teenager, growing up in East London, in a very diverse school, I still felt like I needed to deny who I was or deny my culture or my background. And it's only as I got older, probably around the time of kind of university and in my early 20s, that I actually understood what being a Punjabi meant, what being a South Asian meant, or what being a Sikh Punjabi meant. Like, I only really understood that in my early 20s and not so long ago. And that is a process I went through with my poetry, but I'm also going through with my family and with my mum and with my dad. And my poems also share a lot of their migration story about when my granddad first migrated here in the early 60s, what their journey was like and how that has now impacted who we are today as kind of second and third generation. Something opened at that point. Something about me wanted to challenge stuff that I'd already learned, especially in school. The history curriculum back then and even till today is very Eurocentric. It is very white, it is very male dominated, and there is nothing of histories of people of colour, there is nothing of histories of women or women of colour. It may be one section in a textbook and it's up to that particular teacher how much time they spend on that or how much depth they give to that. And it was only when I got to degree level that I was like, okay, what I've been told about the world around me or what I thought I understood about the world around me is not completely true. And that's when I started to want to learn more about who I was, about where I come from, especially being from Punjab and having my family come from Punjab and migrate here. Understanding the context of Punjabis and our history was very important to me at that time. I learned a lot about Indian independence. I didn't know that much about partition. It was stuff I'd heard my granddad talking about, it's stuff I'd heard my family talking about, but I'd never actually learnt about it as a historian. So I started to read up on partition, I started to read up on Indian independence and realised that for my community, Indian independence was nothing to celebrate. Partition ended up displacing millions of people, ended up being the biggest mass migration in human history, and thousands of people lost their lives. And for the Punjabi community since then, we've been lost. We essentially don't have a homeland, and essentially we don't know our history or who we are or where we belong. And as I started learning that as a historian, it then changed who I was as a person completely and my perception of the world. As well as dealing with all that, as a Punjabi, I was also dealing with being a brown woman, about how we're perceived in society and how we're treated in society, as lower class citizens, as a voiceless community, as people that are seen and not heard. I was trying to navigate all of that, and that was actually at the same time I started going through a pretty dark period of depression as well. And all these things are like cycling through my head, and I'm trying to process this all pretty much on my own at that time as well. And then my poetry ended up being the outlet for a lot of those things. Growing up, I didn't see that many faces that I felt looked like me. I didn't hear that many voices that sounded like me. Often growing up, it was usually in comedy or satire that we'd see women, Asian women. And even now, I don't feel like we're fully being represented. There's such a spectrum of amazing South Asian women doing so many amazing different things, but I don't essentially think they've been shown in the mainstream that much yet. I think we're getting there. But what I've kind of shifted my thinking on it. I used to feel before that, oh, why am I not seeing us on the main movie channels? Or why am I not seeing our faces on these main films or on those big platforms? And then I realized, why are we trying to seek that validation? Like, why do we want to get in those spaces if nobody wants us there or nobody thinks it's attractive for us to be there? So I think this has only been in, I'd say, the last year. I've kind of shifted my thinking on it and thought it's more about us creating our own spaces. It's us creating our own work. It's us creating our own dialogue rather than trying to fit into one that already exists. I think we're the biggest sufferers of imposter syndrome. I still do it now. Like, I go into a room and think, you know what, I don't know why I'm here, or I'm probably not as qualified as everyone else here, and I still do that to myself. And I know so many other South Asian women that do that. They go into rooms, or they go into boardrooms, or they go into meetings, and they'll stay quiet because they think that their voice isn't as valid, or they think that they're not as qualified as perhaps that man in the room, or they won't ask for a higher salary, or they won't ask for a higher position at work because they've continuously been told by society and they've continuously convinced themselves that they're not good enough. So the moment that you turn that switch off and say, you know what, I am good enough, a big shift happens. And I'm still figuring it out for myself. And I do take a few steps back, and then I take a step forward, and I take a couple steps back. But I've seen the difference in how I feel about myself, how much happier I feel the moment that I did that for myself. This is a societal issue. This isn't just specific to the South Asian culture that we don't talk about mental health. But I think there is that cultural aspect of coming from where we come from that makes it even harder for men and for women, and for people that even don't ascribe to those gender norms as well. It's perhaps even more difficult for them. I definitely know growing up, I couldn't talk about my anxiety. I couldn't talk about depression. Number one, I didn't even know what it was. Like, when I first had an anxiety attack, I thought I was going to die. I thought, like, am I having a heart attack? That's the only thing I could relate it to, because that's the only thing medically I've heard of before and thought it felt like that. But then it stopped, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to die. But I wouldn't speak to anybody about it because I knew it was being associated with when I was feeling nervous or scared, or in social settings where I wasn't comfortable. And over time, I realized my mood was getting lower. I was feeling sad all the time. I was finding daily activities really difficult to do. But everything I'd heard before about maybe depression was all very negative tropes. I'd heard stuff like they've got bad karma, or they've got black magic on them, or especially as a woman, you'd never get married, or no one's ever going to marry you if you're crazy, or if you're depressed, or if you're anxious. Who's going to want to marry a girl like that or take a girl like that into their family? And having those things reinforced into your head just is forcing you to stay even more bottled up. And that's obviously a perspective from a female South Asian, but I know for South Asian men, relating it to kind of toxic masculinity, they feel as a man they definitely can't talk about their emotions. And I know for South Asian boys it's also just as difficult, or perhaps more so, that they can't talk to anybody. But for a man to admit that that's what they're going through and they need help medically, professionally, or just emotionally from people around them is so difficult. And I've seen it firsthand that it's resulted in so many men taking their own lives because they can't. And it's not immediate. I've realised for a lot of these men it's a bit later on in life, in their 30s, in their late 30s, early 40s. That's when it's hitting them the most. Perhaps that's a point in their lives where a lot of things has built up and they've got so many pressures on them by that point that they just can't take it anymore. And that's why it's so important that we start talking about it, because it's infecting everybody, every age group, every demographic, every gender. It's impacting us all. So how come something that obvious is not being dealt with or being spoken about? I think there's a shift happening. There's some amazing movements and amazing organisations that have started tackling this. There's a group called Taraqi that are focusing on South Asian men. There's the South Asian Mental Health Forum. There are quite a few charities that are now tackling this specifically for South Asians and creating safe spaces for them to connect to people and to talk to people. But I say this for a lot of things, and I think it's something that my dad's like put in my head, but all these things start at home, and these conversations need to start at home. We need to be able to talk about it with our families and the people closest to us for this to actually have a shift. And that is a hard conversation to have. It was a hard conversation for me to have with my parents when I first told them about it or spoke to them about it. And it was something I think a lot of the people around me were aware of, but just none of us knew how to talk about it. We didn't know how to tackle it. And it was a scary process. A lot of those kind of negative labels that I mentioned before did come up, and I had to deal with all of that. But as I got older and as I got more sure of who I was a bit more confident in speaking about it. But I definitely think more needs to be done. I wasn't open about all that before, because when I first started out, I was like, no, I need to be like the strong, confident, powerful woman all the time. And then I was like, that's not realistic, and it's exhausting for me to think I need to be like that all the time. Poetry did save my life. It stopped me from perhaps taking my own life, and it has the power to do that for maybe one other person. That's amazing to me. So yeah, it's not about the whole world seeing it or becoming the #1 bestseller for this or for that. If it's doing that for people, then that's all I can ask for.